February 23rd, 1945, 10:20 in the morning. The air on Iwo Jima tasted of sulfur and death. Volcanic ash clung to the lips of every man who breathed. The island, a grotesque scar of black sand and jagged rock, 8 square miles in diameter, had been burning for 4 days straight. Not from the volcano that gave it birth, but from the fury of 2 nations colliding in the most savage arithmetic of war. Shells screamed overhead in intervals so rhythmic they became a kind of terrible music. Somewhere in the distance, a Marine coughed blood into his palm. Somewhere closer, a Japanese soldier whispered a prayer to ancestors he would join within the hour. And on the slopes of Mount Suribachi, a dormant volcano that rose 554 feet above the carnage, 5 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman began to climb. They carried with them a length of pipe, 20 feet of it, scavenged from a wrecked water cistern, still streaked with rust and grime. Lashed to that pipe was a flag, an American flag, larger than the first one raised hours earlier, measuring 8 feet by 4 feet and 8 inches. It weighed nearly 100 pounds when the wind caught it. The men did not know they were about to create the most reproduced photograph in history. They did not know that what they were doing would become the symbol of a turning point, not just in battle, but in the Japanese understanding of what America truly was. They only knew they had to climb, and so they did. To understand the significance of that flag, of that singular image captured by Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal, you must first understand what the Japanese believed about the American soul in the winter of 1945. For 3 years and 3 months, since the morning of December 7, 1941, when Japanese bombers turned Pearl Harbor into an inferno of twisted steel and burning oil, the Empire of Japan had operated under a foundational assumption that Americans were soft, decadent, individualistic to the point of cowardice, that a nation raised on jazz music, Hollywood films, and the pursuit of personal happiness would shatter when confronted with the Bushido spirit, the way of the warrior, which prized death before dishonor, collective sacrifice above personal survival. This was not mere propaganda, it was doctrine. It was taught in every military academy from Tokyo to Osaka. Japanese Minister of War Hideki Tojo himself had declared that the Americans lacked the spiritual fortitude for a prolonged conflict. They would win a few battles, perhaps. They had the industrial capacity, the raw materials, the factories that churned out ships and planes with unnerving efficiency. But wars, the Japanese command believed, were not won by factories alone. They were won by the willingness to die. And Americans, they were certain, did not possess that willingness in sufficient measure. The early months of the war seemed to confirm this belief. The Philippines fell. Guam fell. Wake Island, after a heroic defense, fell. American forces retreated across the Pacific in a series of chaotic, blood-soaked withdrawals. Japanese newspapers published photographs of captured American soldiers, haggard, starving, hands raised in surrender, and the headlines crowed with a single message: "See, they break." Even as the tide began to turn, midway in June of 1942, Guadalcanal in early 1943, Japanese commanders clung to the belief that American resolve was a facade, a temporary surge of anger that would exhaust itself. They pointed to the mounting casualty lists published in American newspapers, the growing protest movements, the war weariness that seemed to creep into every letter sent home from the front. Surely, they reasoned, a nation that counted its dead so carefully, that mourned each loss so publicly, would eventually choose negotiation over annihilation. Iwo Jima was meant to be the breaking point, the place where American will would finally crack. The island had no strategic value in the traditional sense, no oil fields, no major ports, no cities worth capturing. It was simply a volcanic rock jutting out of the Pacific, roughly halfway between the Mariana Islands and the Japanese home islands. But it had airfields, 2 of them, with a 3rd under construction. And those airfields allowed Japanese fighters to intercept American B-29 bombers on their way to strike Tokyo and other mainland targets. For the Americans, capturing Iwo Jima meant saving lives, providing a safe landing point for damaged bombers returning from their runs, a base for fighter escorts to protect them going forward. For the Japanese, losing Iwo Jima meant the war had come home. So they dug in. Not on the beaches where American naval bombardment could obliterate them, but deep inside the island itself. 22,000 Japanese soldiers under the command of General Tadamichi Kuribayashi spent 8 months carving out a subterranean labyrinth, 11 miles of tunnels, 1,600 reinforced pillboxes, camouflaged artillery positions that could strike from any angle. They stockpiled ammunition in volcanic caves that shielded them from bombardment. They built firing slits at ground level so a Marine might pass within feet of an enemy position and never see it until the bullets started flying. Kuribayashi knew his men would die. He told them as much. In his final orders issued the day before the invasion, he wrote, "We shall fight until the last man. Each of us will kill 10 Americans before we die." It was not a rallying cry. It was a mathematical equation. 22,000 Japanese soldiers, each killing 10 Americans, would mean 220,000 American dead. Enough, perhaps, to make the cost of invasion so unbearable that the United States would seek terms, that the soft, individualistic Americans would choose negotiation over the blood price of total victory. On February 19, 1945, the invasion began. 70,000 Marines of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Divisions stormed the beaches under a sky darkened by the smoke of naval artillery. They expected heavy resistance. What they found was worse, calculated resistance. The Japanese held their fire as the first waves landed, letting the Marines advance into the killing zone. Then, from the high ground, from the caves, from the invisible pillboxes, the island erupted. Machine gun fire, mortar shells, artillery rounds that detonated in the black volcanic sand and sent showers of shrapnel slicing through flesh and bone. Men died in the surf before they ever reached the shore. Others made it 10 feet inland and collapsed, lungs punctured, limbs severed. The sand was so loose, so treacherous, that vehicles bogged down immediately. Tanks became stationary targets. Wounded men, unable to dig proper foxholes in the shifting ash, lay exposed as mortars rained down. By nightfall, more than 2,400 Americans were dead or wounded, and Mount Suribachi, the volcano that dominated the southern tip of the island, still bristled with Japanese guns. The Marines expected to take Iwo Jima in 5 days. It took 36. And in that span of 5 weeks, 6,821 Americans died. Another 19,217 were wounded. It became the only battle in the Pacific where American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties. And for 3 days and 4 nights, as the Marines clawed their way up Suribachi's slopes, the Japanese command watched and waited for the moment when the Americans would stop, when the cost would become too great, when the soft men from the soft nation would finally break. But they did not break. On the morning of February 23rd, a patrol of 40 Marines from Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Regiment, reached the summit of Suribachi. They had fought their way up through landmines and sniper fire, through grenades rolled down the slopes by defenders who knew they were dying but refused to surrender. When they reached the top, they planted a small American flag, a flag they had carried with them from the beach.
It was 10:20 a.m., and when that flag caught the wind, something happened that no Japanese commander had predicted.
The Americans below, the Marines still fighting on the beaches, the wounded lying in aid stations, the sailors aboard the ships offshore, erupted. They cheered. They wept. They stood in their foxholes and waved their helmets in the air. Ships sounded their horns. The sound carried across the entire island, a cacophony of defiance and joy that echoed off the volcanic rock like thunder. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, observing from the command ship offshore, turned to General Holland Smith and said, "The raising of that flag means a Marine Corps for the next 500 years." The Japanese defenders in the tunnels below heard that sound, and they understood, perhaps for the first time, that they had miscalculated. Not about American industrial power, they had always known that, but about American spirit. This was not a nation that would break. This was not a people who calculated the cost of war in terms of acceptable losses and strategic withdrawals. These were men who would climb a volcano under fire, who would die by the thousands for a rock in the ocean, who would fight for an abstraction, an idea called freedom, with the same ferocity that the Japanese fought for their emperor. Hours later, a larger flag was brought to the summit. The photograph Joe Rosenthal captured of that second raising, 6 men straining against the wind to drive the pipe into the volcanic stone, became an instant icon. By March, it had been printed in newspapers across the United States, reproduced on posters, turned into a war bond campaign that raised $26 billion. The image became a symbol not just of victory, but of perseverance, of the willingness to endure unspeakable cost for an ideal. And in Tokyo, in the underground bunkers where the Japanese High Command planned their last desperate defenses, the photograph was studied in silence, because it represented something they had not believed possible. The Americans had not stopped. They had not negotiated. They had not chosen the easier path. They had climbed. There is a recurring motif in the letters Marines wrote home from Iwo Jima. Not about the flag, though many mentioned it. Not about heroism or glory, though those words appear occasionally. The motif is simpler, more human. Coffee. Hot coffee, brewed in a helmet over a can of sterno, passed around a foxhole in the hours before dawn. Cold coffee, gulped from a canteen between barrages. The smell of coffee drifting from a field kitchen set up behind the lines. Coffee, in that context, was more than a drink. It was a symbol of the thing the Japanese had underestimated, the thing that made Americans dangerous. It was a symbol of abundance, yes, of a nation so wealthy it could ship coffee beans across an ocean to men fighting on a volcanic island. But it was also a symbol of individuality, of the small comforts that allowed each man to feel like more than a cog in a machine. The Japanese soldier fought for the collective, for the emperor, for the abstract concept of national honor. The American soldier fought for the man beside him, for the right to return home and live his own life, for the cup of coffee that reminded him he was still human.
This was the difference the Japanese command had failed to grasp. The Americans did not fight because they were willing to die. They fought because they were unwilling to let the future be dictated by those who glorified death. They fought for life, messy, individualistic, precious life. And that made them more dangerous, not less, because a man fighting to preserve his own humanity will endure horrors that a man seeking a glorious death cannot imagine. The battle for Iwo Jima officially ended on March 26, 1945. Of the 22,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were captured alive. The rest died in their tunnels, in their pillboxes, in the volcanic caves that became their tombs. General Kuribayashi's body was never found. It is believed he died in a final suicidal charge in the closing days of the battle, a last desperate attempt to kill 10 more Americans before the darkness took him. The island, once taken, served its purpose. Over 2,400 B-29 bombers made emergency landings on Iwo Jima's airfields during the final months of the war. Each of those planes carried a crew of 11 men. By conservative estimates, the capture of Iwo Jima saved the lives of 24,000 American airmen. The mathematics of sacrifice and salvation, written in blood on black sand. But the true cost of Iwo Jima was not measured in lives saved or lost. It was measured in what it revealed. To the Japanese, it revealed that their foundational belief that Americans lacked the will to endure was a lie. To the Americans, it revealed something equally profound, that freedom is not a birthright but a responsibility. That the soft life, the comfortable life, the life of jazz and movies and personal ambition is built on the willingness of some to climb impossible mountains when the moment demands it. The flag raised on Suribachi flew for 24 days before it was taken down and sent to Washington, where it was displayed at the Navy Yard and later preserved in the National Archives. But its image never came down. It flew on posters and stamps and magazine covers. It was cast in bronze and erected as a monument in Arlington, Virginia, where it stands today, a frozen moment of struggle and triumph. 6 men in eternal silhouette against the sky.
And in Japan, in the decades after the war, that image took on a different meaning. It became a reminder of what they had faced and what they had failed to understand. Not American factories or American bombs, but American belief. The belief that some things, freedom, dignity, the right to live without tyranny, are worth the climb. There is a story told by veterans of Iwo Jima, passed down in reunions and memoirs, about the sound the flag made when it rose. Not the cheers, those came after, but the sound of the flag itself. The way the canvas snapped in the wind, a sharp crack like a rifle shot, audible even over the distant rumble of artillery. One Marine, interviewed 50 years after the battle, said it was the loudest sound he had ever heard, louder than the explosions, louder than the screams, because it was the sound of a promise kept. The promise that America, for all its flaws and contradictions, for all its messy democracy and chaotic individualism, would not yield, would not break, would climb the volcano and plant the flag, even if the cost was unbearable, because some things are worth the unbearable cost. The Japanese had believed they had broken the American spirit. They believed that Pearl Harbor had shattered the soft nation, and that each subsequent battle would drive the fractures deeper until the whole edifice collapsed into negotiation and retreat. They were wrong. The flag rose at Iwo Jima, and with it rose the truth that a people fighting for freedom will always outlast those fighting for death, that abundance is not weakness but strength, that the willingness to die is not the ultimate measure of a soldier, but the willingness to endure, to climb, to suffer, to continue when every instinct screams to stop, for the sake of a future where others will not have to. February 23, 1945, 10:20 in the morning. The air tasted of sulfur and death. And above it all, against the smoke and the ash and the screaming wind, a flag rose and did not fall.